It was late, the kind of late where the house was wrapped in a thick, comforting silence, interrupted only by the soft hum of the television. I had sunk into the couch, letting the stress of the day slowly dissolve as my favorite show flickered on the screen. And then it happened, a sound that shattered the quiet, sending a jolt of alarm through me. "Help!" Her voice was sharp, urgent, slicing through the stillness. It came from upstairs. My heartbeat surged, and before I could think, I was already on my feet, adrenaline flooding my veins. "What's wrong?" I called out. My voice edged with panic as I sprinted up the stairs, skipping 2 steps at a time. "In here!" she yelled again. The sound was slightly muffled but insistent. The bathroom door was slightly open, steam curling into the hallway like ghostly wisps. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I was about to walk into. "I spilled water everywhere," she admitted, frustration laced with relief. "Can you hand me a towel?" The urgency in her voice dissolved into something far more ordinary, but my pulse refused to settle. Grabbing a towel from the linen closet, I stepped closer to the door, pausing just before pushing it open. "Are you okay?" I asked, my hand hovering near the handle. "Yeah, just me being clumsy as always," she replied with a light laugh, clearly trying to ease the tension. "Come in, just toss it to me." The small bathroom was thick with steam, blurring the familiar space, making it feel strangely foreign. She stood there, wringing water from her hair, droplets sliding down her face like tears. For the briefest moment, an unspoken awareness settled over the room. I looked away immediately, as if I had crossed some unseen boundary, even though nothing unusual had happened. Wordlessly, I handed her the towel, deliberately avoiding her eyes. "Thanks," she said casually, as though the moment meant nothing. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of our reflection in the mirror. It was fleeting, yet something about it stuck with me. The way her damp hair clung to her face, the way the water glistened on her skin, there was something in her gaze, a softness, maybe, or perhaps it was just the way the dim light played tricks on my mind. Whatever it was, it left me unsettled. I mumbled something incoherent and hurried out, my face burning. Back in the living room, I tried to focus on my show, but the moment replayed in my mind on a loop. It wasn't about what had happened, it was about how it made me feel. Confused, unsettled, strangely alert. I told myself I was overthinking, that it was just an ordinary mishap, something that happened in households every single day. And yet the image lingered, the steam curling around her, the way her voice softened when she thanked me. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on the television, nor could I distract myself with the usual mindless scroll through my phone. When I finally climbed into bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, her voice echoed in my mind. "Come in, just toss it to me." Simple words, but they felt heavier than they should have. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of doorways, mirrors, and voices calling out for help. I woke up before dawn, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name. What's wrong with me? It was just a moment. I repeated that thought over and over, trying to convince myself, but deep down I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back to the way things were before. The days that followed drifted by in a blur. I told myself nothing had changed, that life continued as usual, and on the surface that was true. Mornings passed in routine. Conversations over breakfast were as casual as ever. The steady rhythm of daily life remained unchanged, but for me, something was different. Subtle, quiet, yet impossible to ignore. I started noticing her in ways I never had before, and that realization alone unsettled me. She would sit on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, scrolling through her phone with an absent-minded smile. It was the kind of smile I had seen countless times before, one that had never meant anything. But now, it held my attention in a way I didn't understand. She hadn't changed, I had, and I hated it. It started small, a glance that lingered too long, a silence that stretched just a little beyond comfort. I found myself avoiding her eyes, afraid of what she might see if she looked back at me for too long. Did she notice the shift? Did she feel it too? The thought alone made my skin prickle with unease, and so I started keeping my distance. But in a house as small as ours, avoidance wasn't easy. The spaces we shared, the kitchen, the living room, the narrow hallway, became battlegrounds of restraint. She would pass by, her laughter ringing out from a phone call, or she'd ask for something simple, like grabbing a jar from a high shelf. And each time, I would force myself to respond normally, to act as if nothing was different, even as my heart raced with the effort. Then, one evening, as we sat at the dinner table with our parents, the tension inside me became unbearable. She was telling a story, something about a coworker who had accidentally sent an email to the wrong client. Everyone laughed, including me, but my laughter felt hollow, distant. I wasn't listening to her words. I was watching the way her hands moved as she spoke, the way her fingers danced in the air to emphasize a point, and suddenly I realized I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending for much longer. Shame clung to me like a shadow, trapping me in a cycle of thoughts I couldn't break free from. After dinner, I retreated to my room, shutting the door behind me with a firm click. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I stared down at the floor, struggling to understand why everything felt so heavy. Why couldn't I just let it go? Why did this strange feeling settle over me like an unshakable fog? The next morning, I made a decision. I would act like nothing was wrong. I had to push through it, convince myself that things hadn't changed, that I could go back to how things were before. But the universe had other plans. From the kitchen, her voice called out, "Can you help me move the table? I'm trying to clean underneath it." I hesitated for a moment before answering, "Yeah, give me a sec." When I stepped into the kitchen, she was already pulling the chairs aside, her hair tied back in a loose bun. She glanced up, smiling as I approached, and I felt that familiar unease creeping back in. Forcing a smile in return, I moved to the opposite end of the table. "On 3?" she asked, gripping the edge. "Yeah," I replied, positioning my hands. 1, 2, 3. We lifted together, shifting the table a few feet to the side. It wasn't particularly heavy, but the effort left us both slightly out of breath. She let out a soft laugh, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Thanks, I couldn't have done that alone." "Alone. No problem," I said quickly, my eyes darting away. I turned to leave, eager to escape the moment, but her voice stopped me. "Wait. Can you hold this while I wipe underneath?" She handed me a corner of the tablecloth, her fingers grazing mine in the exchange. It was such an innocent touch, fleeting and inconsequential, yet it sent an unexpected jolt through me. For half a second, I froze. Then I took the cloth, gripping it tightly as she crouched down to clean the floor. From where I stood, I could see the focus in her expression, the small furrow in her brow, the way her sleeves had slipped up to reveal her forearms. I hated myself for noticing, hated that my thoughts wandered to places they shouldn't. When she finally stood and dusted her hands off, I let go of the cloth quickly, stepping back as if the added distance might grant me some clarity. "Thanks again," she said, flashing another easy smile before turning away to grab the cleaning supplies. I mumbled something, words that even I didn't register, and left the kitchen as fast as I could without making it obvious. Back in my room, I leaned against the closed door, heart pounding. This had to stop. I couldn't keep feeling this way. I knew it was wrong, and yet knowing didn't make it any easier to fight. The rest of the day blurred by. I avoided her as much as possible without making it noticeable, keeping my head down, searching for distractions, anything to drown out the thoughts swirling in my mind. But no matter what I did, they found their way back. The way she smiled, the sound of her laughter filling the room, the brief, almost accidental touch of her hand against mine. Each moment replayed in my head, uninvited, relentless. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts pressing down on me with suffocating weight. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. But what? And how? I had no answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at me, keeping me restless and wide awake as the hours slipped by. I was still in my room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when a soft knock came at my door. It was hesitant, almost unsure. Before I could answer, she peeked her head in, a playful smile on her face. "Hey, I have a favor to ask." Setting my phone aside, I sat up. "Sure, what is it?" "I'm playing at a small event tonight. Nothing fancy, just something for work. Can you come? It'd mean a lot to me." I blinked, caught off guard. She'd never mentioned being part of any musical events before. "You're playing?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, trying to downplay it. "Just a little piano. It's not a big deal, but I'd like you to be there, if you want to." I hesitated. We'd never been the kind of siblings who showed up for each other's events, never cheered each other on from the sidelines, but something in the way she asked made it impossible to refuse. "Yeah, okay, I'll come." Her face lit up, and my hesitation melted. "Great, it's at 7. Don't be late." The event was held in a modest but elegant hall, dimly lit with warm golden lights that reflected off polished wooden floors. A small audience had gathered, a mix of co-workers, friends, and family members of the performers. I found a seat toward the back, hoping to remain unnoticed. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a simple, unpolished tune, something casual and light-hearted. After all, she had never once mentioned being serious about music. The evening began with a few other performers. Their pieces were pleasant, though nothing particularly memorable. I clapped politely, stealing glances at her as she waited for her turn. She sat at the edge of the room, her posture relaxed, but I noticed the way her fingers fidgeted in her lap. She caught me watching and gave a small wave, her smile a mixture of nerves and excitement. Then her name was called. The room fell silent as she stood and made her way to the grand piano at the center of the stage. A strange sensation settled in my chest, something between anticipation and an unfamiliar sense of pride. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. The audience held still, the air humming with quiet expectation. For a moment, there was nothing, and then she began to play. The first notes were soft, hesitant, a whisper that pulled the room closer. But as the melody unfolded, it grew richer, more confident, weaving a sound that filled every corner of the space. I sat frozen, my breath caught. This wasn't just music, it was alive. Each note carried something raw, something deeply personal. Her hands moved with effortless grace, her fingers dancing across the keys as though they had a mind of their own. The melody shifted, now haunting and melancholic, now soaring with light and hope. It was mesmerizing, the kind of performance that made time irrelevant. I couldn't look away. In that moment, the entire room disappeared, leaving only her and the music. And then there was her expression. She wasn't just playing, she was pouring herself into the piece, as if the piano was the only way she knew how to speak. Her eyes were half closed, her face lost in emotion. It was like witnessing a language I didn't understand, yet could feel in my bones. The final notes hung in the air, a delicate echo that left the room breathless. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the applause erupted, breaking the spell but not diminishing its power. She stood and gave a small, humble bow. Her cheeks flushed as she returned to her seat. I clapped until my hands stung, my heart still racing. I had known her my entire life, yet in that moment she felt like a stranger with a depth and talent I had never imagined. How had I missed this part of her? How could someone I thought I understood so well still manage to surprise me like this? After the performance, a small reception was held in an adjoining room. People mingled, chatting and offering compliments to the performers. I found her standing near the refreshments, a glass of water in hand, laughing at something a colleague had said. When she noticed me, her face brightened and she walked over. "Well?" she asked, her tone light, but there was a trace of nervousness beneath it. "What did you think?" I struggled to find the right words. I didn't know you could do that." She laughed, a soft melodic sound that somehow echoed the music she had just played. "Do what? Play the piano?" I shook my head. "Not just play. make it come alive like that. It was incredible. Her smile softened, and for a moment she looked almost shy. Thank you. That means a lot. I wanted to say more, to tell her how deeply it had affected me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, feeling both awestruck and, strangely, a little envious. How could someone possess so much talent, so much beauty, and keep it hidden? The drive home was quiet. She seemed content, staring out the window with a small, peaceful smile, while I wrestled with emotions I couldn't fully untangle. Her music had stirred something in me, something deep and unnameable. I felt inspired, yet overwhelmed, proud, yet intimidated. It was a confusing mix of admiration and something else I couldn't quite define. As we pulled into the driveway, she turned to me. "Thanks for coming tonight. It really meant a lot." I nodded, my voice catching in my throat. "Anytime," I managed to say. But as we stepped into the house, I knew the night would stay with me. Her music had revealed something about her, about myself, something I couldn't ignore. And for better or worse, I knew things between us would never be the same. The guitar case in my hands felt heavier than it should have, though maybe that was just the weight of my excitement. I had been saving up for months, and today was finally the day. I had done it. I had bought my first guitar, a sleek, acoustic beauty with a polished mahogany body that gleamed under the store lights. Carrying it home felt like carrying something precious, something that symbolized independence, creativity, and maybe even a fresh start. As I stepped inside, I heard her humming softly from the living room. The melody was familiar, yet just out of reach, the kind of tune she always carried effortlessly. I took a deep breath and adjusted my grip on the case. I wanted her to see this. I wanted her to know I was serious about learning, about creating something of my own. I found her sprawled across the couch, a book in her hands, her hair loosely tied back. She glanced up when I entered, her brows knitting together briefly before her gaze dropped to the case in my hands. "What's that?" she asked, sitting up, sudden curiosity in her expression. I grinned, unable to hide my pride. "This," I said, setting the case down and carefully opening it, "is my new guitar. Just bought it today." Her eyes lit up as she leaned forward. "Really? Let me see." Lifting the guitar from its case, I held it up like a trophy. The polished wood caught the light, and even I had to admit, it looked impressive. She stood and came closer, her expression shifting into something almost like admiration. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice warm. "What made you decide to get one?" I shrugged, trying to downplay it. "I've always wanted to learn, figured it was about time." She chuckled, crossing her arms. "Do you even know how to hold it properly?" I laughed a little sheepishly. "I've watched videos. I know the basics." She held out her hands. "Let me see. I've played before, you know. I might be able to give you some tips." Her confession caught me off guard. "You play guitar?" "I used to," she admitted, taking the instrument gently from my hands. "Not as much lately, but I still remember the basics." She settled onto the edge of the couch, the guitar resting naturally in her lap. With practiced ease, her fingers brushed against the strings, producing a simple yet clear chord. Her grip adjusted automatically, her movements fluid, as if she had been playing her entire life. The sound filled the room, warm, rich, resonant. "You never told me you could play," I said, sinking into the armchair across from her. She glanced up, smiling faintly. "You never asked." Then, without another word, she began to play. The chords were slow and steady at first, then melted into a gentle melody. It wasn't showy or overly complex, but it had a rhythm that was calming, almost hypnotic. Watching her, I felt something stir inside me, a mix of admiration and something harder to define. She looked so at ease, so natural with the guitar in her hands, as if it was simply an extension of herself. When she finished, she set the guitar down carefully and met my gaze. "It's a good instrument," she said. "You picked well." "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. That sounded amazing. She shrugged, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. It's just muscle memory. You'll get there too, with practice. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Can you teach me? Her expression softened. Sure, she said. I'd like that. Later that evening, we sat together in the living room, the guitar balanced in my lap as she guided me through the basics. She showed me how to position my fingers properly, how to strum without hitting the strings too hard, how to find the right angle for my wrist. Don't press so hard, she said, her hand gently adjusting mine on the fretboard. You're not trying to strangle it. I laughed, easing my grip. Sorry, it's harder than it looks. You'll get the hang of it, she assured me, her voice encouraging. Just keep practicing. The more she taught, the more I realized how much she knew. Not just about playing, but about music itself. She explained the theory behind chords, the importance of rhythm, even a little about the instrument's history. She wasn't just someone who dabbled in music. She understood it deeply, in a way that made me feel both inspired and inadequate at the same time. As the evening wore on, I managed to string together a few clumsy chords. They didn't sound great, but she clapped anyway, her smile wide and genuine. See, she said, grinning, you're already getting better. Barely, I muttered. I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. But thanks for the encouragement. She stretched as she stood, her movements effortless, almost graceful. I'm going to make some tea. Want some? Yeah, that'd be great, I said, carefully placing the guitar back in its case. As she disappeared into the kitchen, I leaned back in my chair, my gaze lingering on the instrument. It felt like more than just a guitar. It was a bridge, a way to connect with her in a way I never had before. I didn't know if I'd ever be as skilled as she was, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had something to work toward, something worth striving for. When she returned, she handed me a steaming mug and settled back onto the couch. So, she said, tilting her head slightly, what's the first song you want to learn? I smiled, a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the tea. Something simple, I said. I'll let you pick. She grinned, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Careful, I might make you learn something really embarrassing. Deal, I said, laughing, really laughing for the first time in weeks. The tension I had been carrying, the weight I hadn't even realized was there, seemed to lift. In its place was something lighter, something easier. It wasn't just about the guitar, it was about her. And maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to understand her in a way I never had before. The weeks that followed were some of the best we'd had in years. Our guitar lessons became a routine, a quiet ritual that wove us closer together in ways I hadn't anticipated. We laughed at my mistakes, celebrated my small victories, and sometimes just sat in silence, letting the music speak for us. But beneath it all, something lingered, a quiet tension, an unspoken question neither of us dared to voice. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was there, waiting in the spaces between words. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural closeness that came with spending more time together. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. One evening, she appeared in my doorway, hesitation written across her face. Can we talk? She asked softly. Of course, I said, setting the guitar aside. She sat at the edge of my bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and the silence was unbearable. Then finally, she took a deep breath and looked up. I've been offered a job, she said, in another city. It's a big opportunity, and I think I'm going to take it. The words hit me harder than I expected, like a punch I hadn't seen coming. Leave? The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I had been so caught up in the present, in our newfound connection, that I had never considered the possibility of it ending. When? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Next month, she said. I wanted you to be the first to know. I nodded, struggling to process it. That's great, I managed, forcing the words out. It's an amazing opportunity. It is, she said, but there was a sadness in her smile, something unspoken behind her eyes. I didn't want to leave without telling you how much these past few weeks have meant to me. Teaching you, spending time together, it reminded me how important you are to me. Her words lodged a lump in my throat. You're important to me too, I said, my voice quiet but firm, more than I can even say. For a moment we just sat there, the weight of what was coming settling over us. Then, almost without thinking, I reached for the guitar and held it out to her. Play something, I said. One last time. She hesitated for only a second before taking it, and then she played. The melody was soft, aching, carrying a bittersweet emotion that perfectly matched the moment. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, imprinting itself into my memory. When the final notes faded, she looked up, her eyes shining. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. I swallowed hard. No, I said, my voice breaking. Thank you. The night before she left, I found her sitting in the living room, gazing out the window. I sat down beside her, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was different this time, not heavy, not awkward, just full. Finally, she turned to me, a small, knowing smile on her lips. You're going to do great things, she said quietly. I know it. I met her gaze, holding on to the moment. So are you, I replied. The next morning, I stood on the porch, watching as her car disappeared down the street, taking a piece of me with it. I didn't cry, though I wanted to. Instead, I stepped back inside, picked up the guitar, and began to play.